The next part of our program is a guest speaker and a little bit about Ralph Bristol. Ralph is a Nebraska native and lifelong Cornhusker fan. He joined the Air Force in 1971, was honorably discharged in 1975. He finished a 41-year career in radio and television broadcasting in 2018. The last 11 years, he served as the morning drive host of 99.7 WTN Radio in Nashville. Ralph is married to Mariana Leahy, and between the two of them, they have 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. Ralph is a member of the 54 Donelson Station Advisory Council and captain of the Grumpy Old Baggers Cornhole Club. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to invite Ralph up to speak.
Thank you, Tracy.
First, want to say happy birthday to the U.S. Marines. Marine Corps. 248 years young today, right, Troy?
Right.
And Troy was one of the first people that ever signed.
Thank you, Ralph.
It was 212 years ago that I raised my right hand and swore to preserve and defend the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. A half a century. A half a century, wow. I think that makes me, and most of you in here, an antique veteran. Is that right? Of the 7 members of my nuclear family, my father, mother, and 5 children, 3 of us served in the military. My father served in the Army in World War II, landed on Utah Beach. My brother and I served during the Vietnam War, some of it, in Vietnam. Me in the Air Force, all stateside. I want to talk a little bit about each of our service to demonstrate that maybe all service is equal in the minds of many. In my mind, it's not quite. Some services a little more equal than others. My father being here, my brother being here, and me being down here. I'm one of those veterans for whom, whenever somebody says, thank you for your service, I'm thinking, for what? Because I worked about 4.5 days a week in a very comfortable office in California and then Illinois, and left with a free ticket to college. So I say, thank you for my service. But in my defense, and others like me, I did take that oath seriously, I still do, and I would have faced enemy fire had that been in the cards for me. Thank God it was not. After basic training, I was sent to Travis Air Force Base, California, where I served as the sports editor and then the editor of the base newspaper. Followed by 2 years at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois, which was at that time MAC headquarters, Military Airlift Command headquarters. They've changed the name of that command since then. I was the editor of the MAC News Service, which just simply meant that I collected news from all the other MAC bases and sent it back out to all of them at the same time. It was the most boring job I ever had in my life, but that's what I was assigned to do, so that's what I did. The highlight of my time in service, exactly a half century ago, 1973, when the Vietnam prisoners of war, our prisoners of war, came back home from Vietnam, almost all of them through Travis Air Force Base, after a stop first at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. And with the tarmac lined by more television cameras than I've ever seen in one place in my life before or since. I think there were about 300 media there at the time covering the return of those prisoners. Each one of them, one by one, a C-141 or a C-9 would land on the flight line, and they would walk down the stairs and they would meet their families right there in the middle of the tarmac. Some of them who hadn't seen their families for 7 years. They were prisoners of war that long. The family reunions led the news all over the country for several days. I'm sure many of you remember that. I was right in the middle of that, trying to help the media. Among those held in captivity the longest was Navy Captain John McCain. He was the first to speak at a news conference at Travis after they all landed. Most of the questions and answers had to do with torture. McCain described how the Viet Cong tied his hands behind his back and lifted him up off the ground by his hands tied behind his back, wrenching his arms out of his socket, which is why he could never thereafter lift his arms higher than about right here. That was it. That assignment was my first experience with live radio. I was answering calls from the media about the condition of POWs that were being helped out in our base hospital, and I was given approved information that I could share with the media that I had to stick to. One day, my captain, Captain Wilson, handed me some breaking news about a prisoner of war from San Francisco. That's his native town was San Francisco. Had to have his leg amputated at the base hospital. What Captain Wilson or I knew was that this information had not yet been shared with the patient's family. So when I shared it in a live interview with KCBS in San Francisco, I became the person who told the patient's wife and parents via live radio that their loved one had his leg amputated. They were not happy with that. Understandably. Fortunately for me, my captain took the blame for it, and I was not, no consequence for me. He also recommended me for that job of MAC News Service editor at MAC headquarters in Scott Air Force Base. I was bored to tears for 2 years editing and disseminating news about each of the MAC bases to the rest of them once a week. It was at Scott that I started listening to talk radio, specifically KMOX in St. Louis, after I was discharged. Finally, I finished college with a degree in radio and television, eventually led me to my job as a radio talk show host after many years as a radio reporter and news director, television reporter and news director. And it was during that first job as a talk show host that I met Mariana, the smartest talk show caller in the history of the media, and my better half now for more than a quarter of a century. My brother Ray, 1 year my elder, entered the Army immediately after high school. I waited 2 years to enter the Air Force after I graduated from high school, 1 year after him. So he got out of the Army just before I went in, and he was first assigned to one of the coldest parts of Alaska. And because of that, he volunteered for service in Vietnam. And I asked him to write about some of the more memorable and the important aspects of his service so that I could share that with you, and he did. And I want to quote, he wrote a really good story. I can't use it all because it's simply too long, but I want to quote from some of it. He said, I entered the Army for a volunteer 3-year enlistment to be a radio repair technician in order to get the GI Bill and support a college education. By the way, my brother and I are the only two of our family to graduate from college, and both of us were helped by the GI Bill, so thank you again. He said, while stationed in Alaska in the winter of 68, 69, after a week in the field living in a tent with minus 30 to minus 60 degree temperatures, I requested a transfer to Vietnam. And then, after arriving in Vietnam on May 23rd, 1969, my first task was latrine duty. This involved pulling a half steel barrel out of the outhouse, dumping in diesel fuel, lighting it, and stirring it around until all the waste was burned. Isn't that a fantastic job? And then he wrote a lot about fighting mosquitoes for a long time. So he fought cold in Alaska and then mosquitoes in Vietnam. So far, so good. After settling in at the 82nd Airborne, he says, I got quite proficient at repairing radios and starlight scopes. You know what a starlight scope is? It's a night vision glasses, goggles, or scopes, both, all three. Parts were always hard to get, but I learned how to modify the main RT524 radio. That sound familiar to anybody? Okay. And could pretty much always get one to do what needed to be done. I can't remember how many months later, the 82nd was called back to the States, and I was transferred to the 9th Infantry Division. At the 9th, I was supervised by a first lieutenant who became a lifelong one of my best friends, and I met Mary Jo some years later when we were both attendants in his wedding. And he married Mary Jo, and he now has 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Or is it 2 grandchildren? Anyway, I forget. He says, I did have to support remote fire bases, and the best way to get to them was by helicopter. The helicopters never had doors so that we could get in and out of them fast. One of my flights were during the day, most of my flights were during the day, so basically a great tour of the countryside. I really liked flying in helicopters. One night though, when I was into several beers at the NCO club, a call came to load up in 10 minutes with a spare radio, helmet, flak vest, and M16 loaded. A fire base had totally lost radio contact, so no one could call into them for artillery support. We were about halfway through to the fire base when the pilot came on and told me to get ready to shoot when the lights came on because we were making an ammo drop to a squad in a hot LZ in the middle of a rice field. We got the drop made, no one shot at us, and my adrenaline level returned to normal when we reached the fire base. My adrenaline level was returning to normal now. I don't know why. I always get nervous when I talk after 40-some years on the radio and television, but I do. I got the radio working shortly and the calls were resumed for artillery support. I spent the rest of the night experiencing how a 105 howitzer team works. I ended up spending 2 nights there making sure they would not have more radio problems and gained an even bigger understanding of life in the field and the need to do everything possible to support them. My life at the base was pretty easy compared to theirs. He went on, radios don't have much range unless they're connected to an antenna on the highest tower possible. At one of the bases, we had a 450-foot, 4-legged radio tower with stairs on the inside. One night, we had a guy go to the top of the tower with a bottle of whiskey, and halfway through the bottle, got too scared to come down. For some reason, it became a radio problem to go up and bring him down. I'm good with heights up to about 50 feet and then lose control of my muscle coordination. But I found out that if I would go up about 50 feet, then take 10 minutes or so to adjust, my muscle coordination would come back. I finally got to the top and got the guy and his half bottle back down. A little later in the story, he writes, another addition to my MOS, once in a while we would have one of the guys spend a night with the MPs in Saigon, where we would have to send an officer to pick them up and bring them back. Saigon was a city of 7 million people that was designed for about 700,000. As you try to drive your way through all those people, they tended to quickly steal your spare tire and gas can off the back of the Jeep. The solution became to take me and my M16 along, which I would point at the would-be thieves as we'd work our way through the crowds. I never lost a gas can or a spare tire. He ends, a lot of guys had a difficult time transitioning from their RVN life back to a civilian society. That was especially true of those who acquired a chemical dependency, were significantly wounded and disabled, and who ran into domestic protesters against the American involvement in Vietnam. I was fortunate not to be saddled with those issues and had great family support from my dad Everett, who was a World War II vet, my mother Jerry, whose cooking I miss dearly, but who always included fixings for butterscotch pies in her care packages, my sister Marie in Omaha, where I decided to go to college, and my brother Ralph, also in Omaha, who got me my next job as a butcher at a grocery store and also split an apartment with me. By January of 1971, my transition back to civilian life was complete, and I was busy with my new civilian MOSs of butcher and electrical engineering student. After I read his story, I wondered if it might not be a good idea to collect a whole bunch of stories like this from my fellow Vietnam veterans and make a book out of it. I don't know if anybody would read it, but I think I would. Which brings me to my father's service. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of stories to tell you about my father's service, which was the most dangerous of all. He just simply did not talk about it, and when you asked him, he said, yeah, I went, I came back, I made it back home, what's to tell? Well, there's quite a bit to tell, but not from him. I have here, though, a tattered journal that, with the pages held together by staples. I don't know how many of these were ever published. It was written by the Public Affairs Office of the 5th Armored Division in the Army, This is older than me. Dad was part of Company B's tank infantry team, and I'm going to read just part of a paragraph from page 25, which tells me more about my dad's service than he ever did. It has a headline, Supply Routes Shelled. B Company of the infantry dug in on the objective and began to think about resupply. Between them and the supply point was a little over a mile of open ground, pounded by continuous artillery and mortar concentrations. Casualties had been so heavy that carrying parties could not be formed. T5 Virgil E. Westmoreland volunteered to drive his half-track to the rear assembly for supplies. You know what a half-track is? For those who don't, a half-track is a vehicle that looks kind of like a long Jeep, a big long Jeep. In the front are tires, and in the back, instead of tires, is a track like a tank. A little like a tank. Not quite, but similar. Leaving his company at 2000 hours, he drove through the enemy fire and over fields that were two tanks had been disabled by mines to the supply point and back. During the night, he made a total of 6 trips. One trip, a tire was punctured by a shell fragment. Westmoreland dismounted, changed the tire, and continued on his job. T5 David E. Bristol, that's my dad, and PFC Walter C. King made similarly dangerous trips for the mortar platoon. That's about as much as I know about my dad's service, except that he came home with a Bronze Star. Mariana's dad also served in World War II. He was a navigator on a B-29, made bombing runs to Japan. He wanted to be the navigator because there were more planes, more bombers went down because they ran out of fuel on their way back home than were shot down. So that's a little bit about our service. My dad was a hero, as was Mariana's dad. My brother faced danger in Vietnam. My biggest danger was my own youthful discretion, as I spent all of my time back home. But I still took that oath to preserve and defend the Constitution seriously, which brings me to a final thought. There is one existential threat on which veterans could take the lead today. That is the $34 trillion debt that's now growing at a rate of $2 trillion a year, for as far as the eye can see, because spending has outpaced income at an unsustainable rate in many politically difficult areas, including veterans' benefit, specifically and especially disability. Spending on VA disability is growing at one of the fastest rates of any area in the budget. And although it's not one of the largest areas, they're the largest items in the budget, not even close compared to Social Security and Medicare and other defense spending. There is still unsustainable growth because Congress just keeps creating new avenues for veterans to claim disability. They love us. They can't help us. Bless their hearts. We might need to turn some of that down. If you're a veteran who faces a financial burden brought about by your disability suffered as a result of your service, by all means, claim your disability payment and do it with honor. But I would ask those who are tempted to seek a disability check just because they qualify. My brother could qualify because he was around burn pits. That's all you need now. That's the latest thing. If you were anywhere in the area of burn pits, you can probably claim a military disability and receive it. Many people anyway. I asked Ray if he'd ever thought about it. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. Thank you. Avoid the temptation if you're just in it for the money, because I'm serious, and it's not just me. Admiral Michael Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Obama administration, once testified to a Senate committee that the biggest existential threat to the United States is the national debt. A bigger threat, he said, than Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea put together. And I think he's right. Many other serious people have said the same. So what I've asked of my fellow veterans, I think, is a small sacrifice compared to what you were willing to sacrifice when you took that oath. It won't go far to winning the war against debt, but veterans know that our own individual service, no matter how heroic or not, is still only one grain of sand in the beach. We all once pledged to be that one grain of sand in a beachhead to preserve and defend the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So let us veterans lead the way and inspire others, maybe to turn down some of the spending that Congress passes for them, because, bless their hearts, they love us all. To defeat one of the existential threats to the Constitution that we took an oath to defend and preserve. Thank you for being here. If you're a veteran, thank you for your service. Thanks for listening. And to 50 Forward, thanks for having us, your great host.